Thanks. Good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to be back in this room after a few years away. Today, I'm going to speak a bit about surrogate endpoints and benefit. And over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to give you the opposite story from what we read in the newspapers and what we hear at ASCO and ESMO. And so I do have reason for hope and optimism. I know the next generation is listening today, but I think there's some, we have to have some serious conversations within our community about what I call the value crisis in cancer care. I have no disclosures, but once upon a time, I ate a hamburger that cost $80. And for the trainees, we wrote about this in the British Medical Journal, and it might be an insightful story for some of the residents to read about that $80 hamburger. So when it comes to value, much of the attention in our field for the first 10 years or so related to the outrageous prices of cancer medicines. And these prices are unaffordable worldwide. This is not just a problem in low and middle income countries. This is a problem in every health system. And these data have been replicated many times, but we now live in an era where the typical cancer medicine in North America costs $15,000 US per year. Clearly, this is not affordable in an ongoing basis in any health system, let alone in lower and middle income systems. And so that's been much of the conversation, is the price. And this is work from our own group where we tortured a team of medical students to look back through hundreds and hundreds of pages of financial documents for the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies of the world. And what you can see is over the last 10 years, and these students classified the company's revenue as being from cancer medicines or non-cancer medicines. And you can see the orange curve. The entire pharmaceutical sector has shifted to cancer. And while on the one hand, this is exciting for us and our patients because it provides opportunities and resources, there are risks when such vast sums of money get involved with any entity. And you can see here over the last decade, global pharma has had a 70% increase in their sales revenue from oncology, while sales for every other disease have gone down by 18%. So there are massive forces at play. I'm going to speak for a few minutes about the concept of value. As a simple clinician, I conceptualize value as the relationship between magnitude of benefit and cost. And as I've mentioned, much of the conversation in our spaces occurred with the denominator. The denominator is something that we need to protest, advocate, and speak out about. But we have very little control day to day as clinicians when it comes to the denominator. But it's the numerator that we own. That's the conversation that we have with patients. We design the trials, we write the guidelines. And I think we need to take back the power for the numerator. So the questions I encourage my trainees to ask themselves when they're presenting a new treatment to a patient is, what was the endpoint in the clinical trial? What was the effect size or the magnitude of benefit of that endpoint? And do both of those things matter to patients? So we're going to speak a little bit about endpoints and then magnitude of benefit. So progression-free survival, PFS, this is the king of medical oncology. This is an essay I wrote 10 years ago with one of my mentors, Dr. Elizabeth Eisenhower, where we asked the question, is progression-free survival meaningful or is it simply measurable? And I'll come back to that because 10 years later, we're still scratching our heads, and I think the answer is becoming clearer. So these are slides from one of my other formative mentors, Dr. Tannock. These are classic Tannock slides. So Ian teaches us there are only two goals of any new treatment. Any intervention in public health or in medicine should have two goals. We want to help patients live longer, and we want to help people live better lives. Accordingly, the endpoints that matter in any phase 3 clinical trial are overall survival and quality of life. Anything else is an alternative endpoint. We often call these things surrogate endpoints, or as Elizabeth likes to say, putative surrogate endpoints, because most of the time they have not been found to be valid surrogates for the things that matter. So this is the second classic Tannockian slide. What should we call an agent that increases progression-free survival, has no effect on survival, and adds toxicity? I'll tell you this slide defines almost everything that Dr. Sullivan just learned about at ESMO a few weeks ago. Okay? This is pretty standard practice, okay? So what do we call this? At ESMO, they call it many, many exciting things. And Dr. Tannock comes back to the ground and says, actually, many of these things are probably harmful. If we're not helping people live longer lives or better lives, these things have side effects. They cost the system. They cost patients with something we're increasingly recognized called time toxicity. And we need to be more mindful of those. So why has our field completely embraced progression-free survival? Progression-free survival, despite what we've been told over and over again, it's actually not a valid surrogate for overall survival in most circumstances. There are unique circumstances where it is, and in that case, I'm very supportive of using PFS. But most of the time, it's not a good survival for overall survival. Our friend and colleague, Dr. Bishal Gawali, and others have shown that nor is progression-free survival a valid surrogate for quality of life. If you think someone might feel better if their tumor's not growing, just ask them, do they feel better? What's your pain? We know how to test that, and it's called quality of life. So it remains unclear, why did we embrace in that context? Well, does it matter to patients outside of those things? So this is a project we did because I think the third word in PFS has a lot of emotional meaning for patients. Most doctors don't even understand PFS, let alone patients who are scared, vulnerable, and feeling sick. And so we did a pilot project in Kingston where we removed that third word. And we asked patients, we had real patients who were living life on palliative chemotherapy, so they knew what life on chemo was like. And we didn't use the word progression-free survival. We told them about a hypothetical drug that might delay growth on a tumor scan, which is basically PFS without the S. It was 20 patients, and we did a trade-off experiment where we said, imagine you need to go on a new treatment. It's a choice. Here's a list of standard side effects. This treatment will not help you live any longer, but it will delay the time until a tumor grows on a CAT scan. And we started up at 30 months, 25 months. We're going to march our way down to see where the patient would flip and say at what point that treatment was no longer worthwhile. What we found is that very quickly, 17 of the 20 patients looked at us like we were from Mars and said, what? I wouldn't take this treatment for anything. 2 patients said, oh, I would do it for tumor control, but I would expect 24 months or 18 months of tumor control, not the typical 6 weeks of PFS we see at ASCO. And of course, as expected, 1 person was an outlier and said, I would take any treatment for any benefit. This was a pilot study, only 20 patients at 1 academic center in Canada, and we've just completed a large CIHR-funded study of 4 centers in Canada with 100 patients. Those data are being analyzed now and will confirm largely the data I've just shown to you. So it means that patients are actually more common sense than their oncologists. So my junior friend and colleague, Dr. Bishal, likes to cause trouble, and we wrote this piece a few months ago telling the FDA that they had it all wrong. We said you should not be calling this progression-free survival because oncologists get confused and patients get confused, and we proposed a new term, progression-free interval. Needless to say, they have not yet written back, although they did invite Dr. Tannick to give a lecture last week, so we'll see if they listen to us. And the reason Dr. Tannick gave a lecture last week to the FDA was this piece that we had in JAMA Oncology a few months ago. And this builds on the concept of informative censoring. And the big picture here is progression-free survival. I think I've just shown you, it may or may not be meaningful. And actually, we're learning that maybe it's not even measurable. And so this is an example of an inert compound that had side effects, but no benefit for patients. And you can see the curve on the left is when we run the PFS curves for the experimental and the control with no dropout due to side effects. But when we added in side effects in about 21% of patients dropping out on the experimental arm, which is based on similar trials, we can see you can induce an artifactual benefit in PFS simply by informative censoring. This compound has no tumor effect, but it has side effects. And because patients who drop out of the study due to side effects are removed and their progression events are not counted, you can get artificial findings in PFS. So to put progression-free survival, this is Booth's summary slide, PFS in context. So PFS may be useful if it is a valid surrogate for something that matters, like overall survival or quality of life. And I've just told you that in most circumstances, this does not apply for overall survival, and we know it does not apply for quality of life. Well, perhaps progression-free survival can be useful if tumor control itself matters to patients, and if they derive emotional benefit from this, independent of overall survival or quality of life. However, I would argue this is far from certain. I showed you some pilot data, and when one considers the side effects, financial toxicity, and time toxicity of many of these interventions, it's difficult to imagine that most patients would be willing to accept tumor growth control in a CAT scan of this versus that. Everyone said, did Booth even move his fingers? But that would be an event, right? That's an event, a PFS event. And finally, even if point number 1 or point number 2 are true, it is increasingly clear that at least some proportion of the PFS improvement that we're seeing may be due to artifact. And so I really urge the next generation that's listening here to join our concern in speaking out, why has our field completely embraced progression-free survival? And so 10 years later, I think Elizabeth and I were hoping this issue would have been sorted out. I don't think it has been sorted out, but I do believe the title should say, is progression-free survival meaningful, measurable, or perhaps neither? And this is very sobering because, as Scott's shown, work from our group, PFS is now the dominant endpoint in most therapeutics that we offer to patients. For the next few minutes, I'm going to shift gears. We're going to talk about magnitude of benefit. So does the endpoint matter to patients? What about the effect size or the magnitude of benefit? This is a famous paper from Tito Fojo. They looked at all FDA drugs approved over 12 years for solid tumors. Clearly within that era, there were a handful of real game changers, drugs that transformed the lives for our patients. But you can see in aggregate, those outliers were swimming in a sea of mediocrity. The typical drugs for solid tumors help patients live for an extra 2 months. Many of us were scratching our hands and waving in the air for years without an objective way to measure these things until about 2014, when ESMO and ASCO came out with value frameworks and scoring systems that allow us to quantify the extent that a treatment offers benefit for patients. And so this dates back to my sabbatical when I was living in Trivandrum in 2016. And together with Canadian investigators, investigators from India and from the UK, we applied the ESMO framework to a cohort of all medical oncology trials in major tumors over 5 years. And we found that, first of all, about half of them were positive, meaning there was a p-value with a lot of zeros after it. And medical oncologists are very simple, just like surgeons. We get very excited when we see a lot of zeros after a p-value. And so these met their primary endpoint, quote unquote, they're positive. There'd be a lot of applause at ASCO and ESMO. But when we actually looked at the effect size and we took the ESMO tool to these positive trials, we found that only 1 in 3 actually identified a treatment with meaningful, substantial clinical benefit. And so this translates to only 15% of the clinical trials in our space are finding interventions with meaningful benefits for patients. The research ecosystem is clearly very inefficient. We then asked a question about whether there was a relationship between how well something works and what the cost is. And when Dr. Tanek wants to bicycle to work faster, he spends more money and gets a nicer bike. When Richard wants to get to Mumbai faster, he buys a more expensive jet plane. It's very, very common sense. This is how we live our lives. So that people ask, well, do those contexts apply to cancer medicines? And you can see here, not only is there no relationship between how well the cancer medicine works and its price, if anything, there's an inverse relationship where the lousiest drugs cost the most. Now, I'm not an economist, but this is a broken system, and we need to speak out about that. So what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years? There's actually a good backstory here, which I'll tell over tea later. It was Dr. Tanek who inspired a very young and naive Dr. Booth to launch this program about 30 years ago when I challenged Ian on the ATAC trial. Anyhow, it's a good story we'll talk about later. The line was, young Dr. Booth, oncologists are increasingly impressed with smaller and smaller benefits. And it turns out he was right. So we've updated this now several times, looking at trends in clinical trials. So the most recent decade, we've been doing this since the 70s, the same cohort of trials, the big tumors, drug trials published in major journals. Over the last 10 years, we had 300 trials, and this adds to a database of 1,000 trials over 30 or 40 years. And Scott showed this slide earlier, but you can see that in the 70s and 80s, the oncologists were wise. Overall survival was king. But then us young whippersnippers came along, and the pharmaceutical industry started funding all of our work, and you can see progression-free survival is now king. It is the dominant endpoint in our field. What did we learn from this body of working at hundreds of clinical trials? Well, Scott mentioned industry now controls everything. They fund almost every medical oncology trial. I'm not suggesting that we don't need partnerships with industry, because many of our very important therapeutic advances come from excellent trials done in partnership with industry, but the pendulum has swung far too far. PFS is the dominant endpoint. There's no surprise. Progression-free survival trials are much more likely to be positive. There's no surprise why pharma is choosing this as the primary endpoint. There's a big uptake in medical writers. We'll talk about that over tea later. And then, consistent with Tito's findings from 15 years ago, we found that the median gains are modest, about 3 months for overall survival. So are we giving patients high-value care? Has the bar in oncology dropped too low? I don't want to take away the meaning of 3 months of life for anyone, but again, this comes at a cost to patients and their side effects, their time, quality of life. And there's also something that's increasingly recognized that Ian and I wrote about a couple of years ago called the efficacy to effectiveness gap. And what this means is, over and over again, we've seen that the benefits for new treatments observed in clinical trials are always smaller in the real world. So if we have an expensive treatment in a trial that improves outcome by 2 months, when you give it in the real world with regular doctors and nurses and average patients, the benefit is going to be even smaller than that, and perhaps approaching nil. Just the last paper to highlight here, Scott showed this earlier. So again, this was a global study involving several characters here in the audience. We were interested to see at the global picture, where are we going with clinical trials with endpoints and magnitude of benefit? So this was 700 trials, drug, radiotherapy, and surgery, done over a period of 4 years. And we were interested to see what can we learn from different health systems around the world. We found that, as Scott mentioned, only 8% of clinical trials are led by lower and middle income countries, despite the fact we know that 2/3 of the global cancer burden takes place in these systems. There's a huge mismatch. There's so many paradoxes in global oncology. This is one of them. So we've seen that the landscape is dominated by high income countries, by pharmaceutical industry, and by medical oncology trials. We've seen that cancers of poverty are vastly underrepresented in the global trials landscape. And as medical oncologists, we need to retain some humility and recognize that the vast majority of patients with cancer globally who are cured by surgery and radiotherapy, yet we devote resources so that only 13% of the global trial portfolio are testing new innovations in surgery and radiation. And then the important finding here, point number 4, we can learn from our partners in lower and middle income countries who do not have the luxury of designing trivial trials with thousands and thousands of patients to detect very, very small benefits. So what we found is that clinical trials led by lower and middle income countries are smaller, they're more pragmatic, they're targeting a larger effect size, and guess what? They are more likely to be positive, and the positive trials identify therapeutic gains that are larger. So this is, again, another paradox. The high-income countries should be adopting clinical trial pragmatic approaches that our colleagues in lower and middle-income countries are doing. Yet, the system has structural biases in place so that these papers are being published in much lower impact journals. And so this is what we call publication prejudice. We found evidence that even a positive trial with a major therapeutic advance from a lower middle-income country was published in a much lower impact journal than a negative trial from a high-income country. And so this speaks to structural problems in the way of peer review. Journal editors and peer reviewers need to be more mindful that we need to have a position of equity here and some humility to recognize that there's a lot to be learned, and we need to remove barriers to publishing this important work in the major journals in our field. The last slide I'm going to leave you with, this is a piece of work. Again, several people in the room were very much involved in our capacity with the World Health Organization Essential Medicine List. And this was very sobering. We learned in speaking to 1,000 oncologists from all over the world that the most important medicines that they would take to a desert island, this was called the Desert Island Project, the medicines that they would take tended to be old, generic, cytotoxic drugs and hormones. The medicines we know that have large benefits and arguably should be very, very cheap. These have been around for 20 and 30 years. But what we found is, because of a very, very difficult problem with accessing these medicines, they remain unaffordable for most patients globally. This is what we should be working on collectively for the greatest public health benefit of patients with cancer globally. So in closing, there's a crisis in the value of cancer care. We need the next generation to help us figure this out. Drug price is only one part of the problem. We need to push back advocate against that and speak out. But the numerator is also a problem. Questionable endpoints, small effect sizes. And I think we as oncologists who design trials, write guidelines, and have conversations with patients need to take ownership and responsibility for number 3. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.